This is a story about short-term pain for long-term gain. Argentine President Javier Milei's strong medicine for his economy seems to be working, despite the costs. But recent elections raise doubts about whether the public is willing to stay on a difficult course.
Over the weekend, President Javier Milei was defeated in a key provincial election.
Yo no quiero un fin precipitado ni estoy en contra de la democracia, pero sí una reacción. Si el gobierno no entiende que este no es el modo de manejar, bueno, él sabrá qué rumbo tomar.
Milei's party lost big in the Buenos Aires provincial election, and markets reacted immediately. The peso weakened against other currencies, and stocks tumbled as the country's political and economic future was thrown into doubt.
The Argentina dollar bonds plunging the most in 3 years. That's after a provincial election is now threatening to undermine President Javier Milei's national economic agenda.
By some measures, President Milei has pulled off a near economic miracle, bringing Argentina's inflation rate down from almost 300% year over year in 2024 to just over 30% today. But he got there by imposing austerity measures that hit the country's citizens. David Kim is CEO of Argentina-based textile company Amsud.
The history of Argentina, there was always political problems during election times, and this time is no different. Our employees are very concerned. Some are frightened because the last 2 years we had to lay off 100 employees from 450. We are now 350. It was very difficult.
The problem that you have with the kind of reforms Milei's been putting in place is putting a lot of economic pressure on anybody from the middle class down.
Hans Humes has been investing in Argentina since the 1980s and is chief investment officer of Greylock Capital Management.
A lot of these austerity measures that were imposed, in particular, were hitting the kind of voters that Milei was able to grab to win the election in the first place. And that's the tricky part of it. They were willing to take that pain, but now they want to see something come together for them.
This latest round of turmoil is part of a much longer story, one that Juan Pablo Nicolini has studied over the years. A former economics professor in Buenos Aires, Nicolini is now an economist with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, though he made it clear that the opinions he shared with us are his own and are not the opinions of the Fed.
The Argentinian society has an addiction to government spending that ends up generating fiscal deficits. That is, the government typically has spent in every single year in the last 60, except for a few short periods, more than the tax revenues it collected. As you can imagine, for even a person, a family, a company, if you always spend more than what you make, that leads you to trouble. And that was basically the nickname of Argentina for the last decades, trouble, economic trouble. And we are now in the process of reverting that. And the question now is going to be whether that's going to be sustained for the next 3-4 administrations, which is what Argentina needs to recover from the addiction.
How did President Milei reduce the deficit?
The whole approach was to reduce government spending that was, for the level of income that per capita that Argentina has, was certainly too high, and that had been increasing substantially in the last 2 decades. And that's where he attacked the problem. The first month of his administration, he managed to achieve a fiscal surplus. Because he did that, then they could also take measures to lower inflation. At the time he was elected, inflation was running about maybe between 5 and 6% per month. And now it's running at about between 1.5% and 2% per month. So it's still very high, but clearly reverted the trend of inflation going up.
The biggest problem is that the costs increased significantly. Even though the inflation has gone down, energy costs have rose about 70-80% in 1 year, and we weren't able to pass those increases onto our selling prices. So we've been selling under our cost. I hope there is a change here.
So inflation has come down. That means prices are more stable than they were before. What has been the effect of unemployment?
The unemployment increased a little bit, and actually that is a pretty good question because we are used to think in very stable economies that typically when you have policies that reduce inflation, one tends to think that that kind of slows down the economy and then that increases unemployment. But when you're running at the inflation rate levels that Argentina was running, which is like about over 200% per year, then when you reduce inflation to, let's say, about only 20 or 30% per year, then you do not necessarily affect economic growth. Or to put it differently, you actually improve economic growth.
So how did we get here? Most economists agree that the long shadow of Juan Perón, the longtime leader of the 40s and 50s, continues to plague the Argentine economy. His populist policies of government borrowing to address poverty and inequality helped the masses for a time, but by the 1960s, they affected inflation, growth, and, above all, the size of the fiscal deficit, something that President Milei sought to address with his vigorous economic agenda when he came to office less than 2 years ago. Argentina, over time, has built up a lot of deficit, but there have been a couple of periods where they did more or less get the fiscal deficits under control. Talk to us about those two periods.
So the first one was during the 90s. It was after a massive hyperinflation. It followed, for instance, one of the worst month was June in 1989, in which inflation rate was 200%. Prices were 3 times what they were at the end of the month than what they were at the beginning of the month. And that really was a big shock for society. And then that's when a government came that proposed a different path, and it fulfilled it. It had a much more responsible fiscal policy. Didn't completely eliminate the deficit, but they were much, much, much lower. And then Argentina had a huge crisis in 2001 and 2002, in which the government couldn't pay the debt. There was a default. Poverty rates went to over 50%. Unemployment went to about 25%, pretty much like what it was the Great Depression in the US. And then following that, we also had a period of 5-6 years with fiscal discipline, and then in which, again, inflation was, we had 2 or 3 years with inflation of only 1 digit, that means like 8%, which again, for Argentina is an amazing success. But then the fiscal deficit started showing up after the financial crisis, and they started going up again, and we went into the same old mistakes of the past.
Let's not pretend that we're back in the glory years of Peronism, where there was enough of a surplus that you could effectively subsidize a big part of the population. Focus on businesses, focus on value-add manufacturing, focus on education. I mean, there's a real misallocation of resources that's happened, human resources that's happened over years in Argentina because of some of the distortions in the foreign exchange markets. You have some of the best business minds playing games with the official rate versus the external rate. That doesn't add a lot of value to the economy. If you go back to the passé leftist rhetoric, that'll be a short-term solution as well.
Argentina is certainly not the only Latin American country that's had its problems with debt, but others have figured out ways to come back from the brink.
The problems that plagued Argentinian economy in the last 3 decades were basically plaguing the region, the Latin American region, in the 70s and the 80s. Countries like Chile, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, they were also running very large deficits, and all of them had a very large and recurrent macroeconomic crisis. But most of those countries learned the lesson, and they have been doing much, much, much better than Argentina. The message is something that you learn in primary school, which is that you cannot buy candy at school if you don't bring your own money. Or you could, because if you have a friend that can lend you the money, then you might have candy today. But then you have to come back tomorrow with extra money to buy your candy and pay your debt back. It's very painful for us, but it's a great example for the rest of the world.
Some investors over time have seen a pattern to the Argentine economic reforms and have taken them into account in their investment decisions.
This time, we're lucky enough to sort of understand that 3 years is generally when Argentine presidents start having problems. So we were able to lighten up quite a bit, and we're actually buying across the board. Markets on the debt side may have only moved 10-15%, but that's still some pretty good returns on the yield basis. I mean, you've got 12 to 15% yields. My assessment is that the lessons have been learned well enough that they can manage it, and we won't go back to any of those really bad times. So we'll see.
Lay out the best case for long-term investment from outside into Argentina right now.
Wow. It would be good to see follow-through on a lot of these reform efforts. I'm curious to see what changes Milei might make in his cabinet.
Investment has been good, but not spectacular. There were a lot of restrictions on financial markets and in foreign exchange markets when the government started. They've been removing some of those restrictions, but not fully yet. Like there are restrictions on international companies to take the profits out of the country. So investment has not been booming as one would expect with the stabilization because there are still some of those restrictions in place.
Many years ago, an Argentine finance minister gave a speech about the painful steps needed to put the country's economic house in order. He concluded that the measures in progress allow us to launch a new formula today. We must get through the winter. Now, 66 years after that address, Argentina finds itself needing to get through another winter. The question is whether the country's people are willing to suffer short-term pain that President Milei says is necessary in order to find long-term gain in a more sustainable fiscal approach. That hangs in the balance.
They say we are crazy to stay here, but we are used to this, and we will be here working in the textile business for many, many years. I think the business owners in Argentina deserve a medal because it's a very challenging country.
I think the entire country understands what has held them back for decades now, and they're willing to take a certain amount of personal pain. Now we have to see how this transition goes and what the new messaging will come. If Peronism is able to prevail in October, what's the messaging that they bring along with it? If it's a return to the same old, I think they'll have lost a huge opportunity.